Everybody thinks they know the story of Dunkirk, right? It's the ultimate underdog story. A miracle of deliverance, all those little ships sailing into the jaws of defeat to rescue an army. But what if I told you that to truly understand the Second World War, you have to flip that story completely on its head? We're going to look at it from the other side of the hill. From the perspective of the army that had victory, total, crushing victory, right there in its grasp, and then just stopped. Because for the Germans, Dunkirk wasn't a miracle. It was a self-inflicted catastrophe that would haunt them for the rest of the war.
Just listen to those words. They're not from some historian looking back with decades of hindsight. They're from the man himself, General Heinz Guderian. This was the architect of the Blitzkrieg, the guy whose Panzer tanks had just ripped the Allied armies to shreds in a matter of days. You'd think he'd be celebrating, right? But no. He was describing the single moment he believed cost Germany everything. He says he was speechless. And look at that phrasing. Not just a mistake, not a setback, but the most disastrous influence on the whole future course of the war. That one quote tells you everything you need to know about the skull of the blunder we're about to unpack.
And this is the core of it all. This is the mystery. I want you to really picture this for a second. You're a German tank commander. For weeks, you've been moving at lightning speed, shattering every defense thrown at you. Now, you've got them. 400,000 enemy soldiers are penned in a tiny pocket, their backs literally against the English Channel. They have nowhere to run. Through your binoculars, you can see the town of Dunkirk, their last possible escape route. Annihilation is not a matter of if, but when. And then, the order crackles over the radio. Halt. Stop where you are. Why? Why on earth would the most powerful, most successful army on the planet slam on the brakes at the very moment of total victory? That is the question we're going to answer. To really feel the shock of that order, you have to understand just how agonizingly close they were. We're talking about May 24th. Guderian's lead tanks, his 19th Panzer Corps, were just 12 miles from Dunkirk. That's it. It's a stone's throw in a tank. The professional heart of the British Army, the British Expeditionary Force, plus the elite French First Army were all trapped. As far as anyone was concerned, the war in the West was, for all intents and purposes, over.
And look at how fast this all happened. The speed was it was mind-bending. Not just for the Allies, but for the German high command, too. The invasion kicks off on May 10th. 10 days later, just 10 days, they've crossed the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, smashed through the French lines at Sedan, and raced all the way to the English Channel. They'd cut the Allied armies in two. This wasn't war as anyone knew it. This was pure, terrifying blitzkrieg, lightning war. They had done the impossible. They held all the momentum in the world. And then they just threw it away. So let's dig into this Halt Order. What could possibly motivate a decision that seems, on the surface, completely insane? Well, it wasn't a single thing. It was this toxic cocktail of personalities, of fears, and of breathtaking arrogance swirling around at the very top of the German command structure. It's really easy to just blame Hitler for everything, but the truth here is a little more complicated. You had three key figures, three fathers of this disastrous decision. First, there's General von Rundstedt. He's the army group commander, an old-school, cautious Prussian general. And frankly, he's spooked. His tanks have moved so fast, their supply lines are stretched thin, they've taken casualties, and a small but sharp British counterattack at a place called Arras made him really nervous. Then you have Hitler himself. He's not thinking like a Führer in this moment. He's thinking like the corporal he was in World War I. He remembers the mud of Flanders, and he has this vivid fear that his precious, irreplaceable Panzers are going to get bogged down in the canals and marshland around Dunkirk. And then, the final piece of the puzzle, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe. He sees a chance for his Air Force to steal all the glory. He swoops in and makes a fateful promise to Hitler. My Luftwaffe can finish the job alone. Let me have the victory. And we don't have to guess at Hitler's state of mind. We have a window right into it. This quote is from the personal diary of General Franz Halder, the chief of the General Staff. He wrote this on May 24th, the very day the order was given. He saw it firsthand. Hitler was so stunned by his own success that he literally couldn't believe it was real. He was convinced it had to be a trap. That deep-seated nervousness, combined with Rundstedt's professional caution and Göring's massive ego, created the absolute perfect storm for one of the worst decisions of the war. So, okay, that's the view from the top. The generals and politicians debating maps. But what was it like for the guys on the ground? For the soldiers sitting in their hot steel tanks who could actually see the prize? For them, it was pure, unadulterated madness. For 3 long days, the most powerful armored force the world had ever seen just sat there. This quote from a Panzer commander named Hans von Luck, it just captures the feeling perfectly. It's almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. We could not understand. Think about it. The entire concept of blitzkrieg, everything these men had been trained to do, everything that had brought them this incredible victory was about speed, momentum, and ruthlessly exploiting any weakness. And right in front of them was the ultimate weakness, a beaten, disorganized army with its back to the sea, and they were ordered not to touch it. It was a professional insult. You can just feel the frustration boiling over. This created one of the most surreal disconnects of the entire war. Back in Berlin, the propaganda machine was gearing up. Joseph Goebbels was already writing the press releases talking about the greatest annihilation battle of all time. But on the coast of France, the German soldiers were seeing something completely different through their binoculars. They weren't seeing an army dying. They were seeing this ghost armada appearing out of the mist. Warships, yes, but also fishing trawlers, ferry boats, even private yachts. It was unbelievable. They weren't witnessing an annihilation. They were the sole audience for a miracle.
And every single hour that the Panzers sat idle, every hour that the generals debated, was another hour the British and French used to stiffen their defenses and, crucially, organize the escape. The Halt Order was finally lifted on the evening of May 26th. But it was too late. The brief window of opportunity for a total war-ending victory had slammed shut for good. Now let's talk numbers, because the scale of the German miscalculation is just breathtaking. Their intelligence services, which were usually top-notch, estimated that best-case scenario for the Allies, maybe 45,000 troops could escape. The actual number? 338,000. Let that sink in. Over 1/3 soldiers. And these weren't just random conscripts. This was the professional, experienced core of the entire British Army. They were the ones who would go on to train the millions of soldiers who would come back and land on D-Day 4 years later. Germany let them go.
And here's the great paradox. What the Germans saw on the beaches actually made them feel good about their decision. They saw this enormous military junkyard, over 84,000 vehicles just left behind. Trucks, jeeps, motorcycles, everything. To the German high command, this looked like proof that they had crippled the British Army beyond repair. It created this incredibly dangerous sense of overconfidence. They saw the shell, but they completely missed that the creature inside had escaped.
It wasn't just vehicles either. They captured almost 2,500 big artillery guns, hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. It was a massive haul. But here's the thing about modern war. Equipment can be replaced. An experienced, trained, and now incredibly motivated soldier cannot. The Germans won the hardware, but they let the software, the men who knew how to fight, get away. It was a trade they would come to regret bitterly. So what happened to Göring's big promise that the Luftwaffe would handle it? Well, it was pure fantasy. First, his best fighter planes, the famous Messerschmitt 109s, were operating at the absolute limit of their range. They'd fly across the channel and have maybe 10 minutes of fuel for combat before they had to turn around. Second, they ran into something they did not expect. Stiff resistance from the Royal Air Force and its brand new fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Third, the weather was awful. On most days, a mix of clouds and thick black smoke from burning oil refineries on the coast made it impossible for the bombers to see their targets. And finally, and this is a part of the story that often gets forgotten, a heroic last stand by 40,000 French soldiers holding out in the nearby city of Lille tied down 7 German divisions. 7 divisions that could have been crushing the Dunkirk pocket were instead stuck fighting a battle they didn't need to. Göring's boast was just hot air.
Look, this 3-day pause, it wasn't just a tactical error in a single battle. This decision fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the Second World War. It's really not an exaggeration to say that the seeds of Germany's final defeat in 1945 were sown right here, on the beaches of Dunkirk in 1940. There's a classical term that describes this situation perfectly: a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory that costs you so much, that inflicts such a devastating toll on your own future that it's basically the same as a defeat. That is Dunkirk for the Germans. They won the battle for France, no doubt. It was a stunning military achievement. But by paying the strategic price of letting Britain's army escape, they turned their greatest triumph into a long-term, fatal liability.
Let's just spell out the consequences, the long shadow this cast. First, and most obviously, because its army was saved, Britain was able to stay in the war.
This forced Germany into the one scenario every German strategist for 100 years had dreaded, a long two-front war. Second, the island of Britain itself became what they later called the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the massive, secure base from which the Allied invasion of Europe would eventually be launched. And finally, something you can't measure on a map, the escape created the Dunkirk spirit. It was this powerful psychological belief in Britain that they were somehow invincible, that they could survive anything. Germany had captured an army's worth of equipment, but in exchange they had forged an entire nation's will to fight to the bitter end.
And so that leaves us with this final, crucial question. The German army of 1940 was a machine of tactical genius. They pulled off a victory that left the entire world in shock. But in their moment of triumph, a combination of fear, arrogance, and a fundamental failure to understand the bigger picture led them to let their enemy get off the mat. They won the battle, but in doing so, they guaranteed they would eventually lose the war. It's a powerful lesson that's still relevant today, isn't it? It forces you to ask, what does it really mean to win?